Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel, News for Views. My name is Zasha. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So today we will explore how the creator economy is reshaping journalism, taking traditional news values and moving it into a more creator-based economy where people are finding their content and their news and the information that they're gaining off of a more social media app-based movement. So I'd like to welcome our panelists for today, who I'm very grateful that they are here. In person, IRL, we have Luke Beardsworth, who is the director at Alma Media. He worked very closely in local news, and he previously spent many moons at Reach PLC as international publisher and helped lead the Curiously project, which is a social media-led video-first creator platform within a national publisher. So welcome, Luke. And then I will start from my top left. We have got Ben here, who is a Financial Times strategist. But hold on. He also has a very impressive resume as the Everything in Moderation founder and the Control Alt Speech podcast. So Ben will be helping cover the ethics side of our conversations today. So that to look forward to. And then we have got Bryony, who is the founder of Bryony Inc., a former and current creator, and also now has her own consultancy firm creating creator infrastructure and ensuring sustainability and the capability for creators to produce the content that we know and love. And then last but not least, we have got Jack Brewster, who is the founder of a app and social media presence called Newsreel. This is a gamified Gen Z platform which sets to avoid doom scrolling and give people content that they are interested in and keep them looking at it all the time and keep them engaged. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, so to kick off, I wanted to go in a little bit of a chronological order that one might think of when thinking of the creator-based economy. So I'm going to put you on the spot now, Bryony. What made you leave almost traditional newsrooms and kind of go into the creator sphere? What led you to that?
Great question, and hello everyone, really nice to see and meet you all. So for context, I spent 7 years at the BBC as a reporter journalist before I made the big pivot to digital, and I'm using those inverted commas because I actually don't think it's as much as a pivot as we think it is. I in the kind of latter part of my career at BBC, I was making documentaries and short films for BBC Stories and BBC Three when it existed then, and I saw an opportunity in the job that I left BBC for was to go to Lad Bible, where they obviously are a huge publisher of a different type. I actually went from news into commercial, so I went straight from producing journalism to producing commercial campaigns. But actually what I saw was quite a lot of consistency from an infrastructure and a production perspective, which is obviously my specialism now, in terms of what the creator economy offers, which is speed and proximity and agility and trust. How we feel about that trust obviously is probably a much wider conversation, but what I kind of had learned at the BBC and through journalism and reporting was also how to make things at speed with agility, pivot fast, have a plan A, plan B, plan C, and also write and make something that's going to build trust with an audience. So I kind of saw quite in that sense quite a straight line from news to the creator economy, and as my career has evolved in the past few years and I've made stuff for Sidemen and I've made stuff with Stephen Bartlett, actually what I kind of thought was true 5 years ago has only actually become truer as I've kind of evolved through this bit of the industry.
I find that really interesting, and I know that you said that trust was a much bigger conversation. I'm really interested about speed. I think that's a big conversation when it comes to creators versus traditional newsrooms, how fast we can get stuff out. We'll lead into that a little bit more in ethics. But Luke, I wonder if you had anything you wanted to add to that, having worked in a national publisher and moved on to the creator sphere within that.
the main thing that comes to mind when thinking about ethics in the world of creators is there was a really high-profile missing persons case that happened in Lancashire not so long ago. Her name was Nicola Bulley, and she went missing and was later found dead. And that was a story that was covered predominantly through creators, and I don't mean that in the sense that traditional news publishers use creators to publish and keep people updated. What I mean is that there was a gap in information, and people were filling that gap on social media, and that became the topic of a police inquiry where they drew loads of conclusions to the effect that that had been quite harmful, and it led to lots of conversations about how open police need to be with the media, for example. But I think that more broadly, it can create a challenging environment, particularly for journalists. If you're a journalist in a newsroom trying to cover a big story, but you know that there is someone out there covering things not only faster than you, but in a way that you might argue is less responsible than you, then that can create lots and lots of challenges. So we don't necessarily think of what creators produce as being around topics such as really high-profile missing persons cases, but that is a good example, and as good example as I've seen, of something where ethics can become a real consideration.
Thank you. I want to head over to Jack now with your newsreel with the app. Is this something that you come across within your newsroom, within your workplace? Do you tackle any of the same issues?
Well, and first of all, thanks for having me. I think it's a little bit different because our entire thesis is that we're trying to build a new platform, a new home for journalists and creators outside of the ecosystem that they're currently on. I don't think telling stories in new formats and vertical video, sometimes even in more engaging ways, is necessarily wrong. What's wrong is the incentives behind them on the other platforms, right? That these platforms are built around selling your attention to the highest bidder, and they've gotten worse, not better, over time at serving the needs of their audiences. So that is, I think, the problem. And what we've done with Newsreel is to build a platform entirely separate from that. So the incentive structures are entirely different. We set out to build ones with the exact opposite incentive structure. So we don't necessarily come across the same problems yet. Maybe we will at some point, but I probably won't be the head of the company then.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And then on a similar vein, Ben, I'm going to read this right out, so don't mind me. Do you think that journalists and newsfluencers will feel pressured to avoid this sort of controversial reporting? A little bit about, what Jack said, it's just a different type of content, different type of clientele. What do you think about that pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I think so FT Strategies has been doing some research about this kind of emerging class of news creators, people who have some journalism training or have come out of a newsroom and who are now kind of breaking away and doing their own thing. We've also kind of extended that a little bit to people who've started to create kind of news as many traditional news organizations would know it, but obviously on their own. So I'm thinking when I'm kind of reflecting here, I'm thinking about that particular class of people because that's who we've done research on, and I can share the link in the chat if people are interested. When we spoke to these creators specifically, and we did a global series of qualitative interviews, they said actually we are determined to create kind of original journalism in as kind of ethical way as possible, abide by principles of transparency and of accuracy and integrity, and we do our best to kind of to do that on a daily basis. It's very, very difficult when you don't have the kind of backing and the support and the back office that many traditional publishers have, or even smaller ones. And so they are trying to create kind of original journalism as much as possible in that context. They also know that original journalism, the stuff that kind of breaks out, the stuff that is properly new and is told in the right format, as Bryony and Jack have said, that's the thing that's going to get them views, it's going to get them to be monetized. There is an incentive to do that to some degree. However, the commercial model, as we've all noted, often means that you might not investigate or go after certain stories for fear of upsetting particular sponsors or particular partners. And not only that, but as Jack mentioned, there is a demonetization risk for just covering news, which all of the creators that we spoke to flagged. You know, they as creators get put into a category, and I'm sure Bryony and Jack can speak to this. You get put into a category called news, and you are less likely to be monetized on YouTube or Instagram or wherever it is. And so that is, you know, a kind of fundamental risk to our industry from the get-go, that platforms think of news in that way as a risk to be mitigated.
That's really interesting. That's definitely something I've seen. It's much harder to monetize hard news than it is to monetize or sponsor anything like pop culture content, you know, the positive stuff that people want to read, or not so positive, just not so dark. Luke, I want to hand over to you because obviously I know during your experience you helped lead the Curiously project. And I think that that would be interesting to talk about in regards that you did have the bureaucrats, the money, the stuff to follow within a large organization and how you found that to balance.
So Curiously was started as a conversation between me and somebody far more important than me. And I essentially made the point that as a 30-year-old at the time who was working in local news, I had a higher than average interest in local news, I think it would be fair to say. And I would also say that most people my age had very little interest in local news. And that, you know, I'm 35 now, and that remains the case. My friends and peers have very little interest in the work that I do. And that's fine. But I made the point to said important person that if I wasn't a local journalist, if I wasn't a journalist, I wouldn't be that interested in anything that Reach was producing at that time. So I think about the hobbies that I had, and I think about gaming and reading and fitness and TV and all these different things. There was no place for me to consume that sort of information on the Reach network at that time. You know, the Mirror would sometimes write about television, but that's not where I would read about television. So I wanted there to be something that filled that. So that's kind of how Curiously got off the ground, and then from there it became a broader project, less focused on my particular interests and more about the interests of people within that demographic of sort of 16 to 34, which is a demographic I am fiercely no longer in, I think it's fair to say. So that then becomes a process where you recruit specifically content creators, which in itself is a challenge as a business that was used to recruiting journalists. And those people therefore came from a broad range of backgrounds. They had different skills. Some people were journalists that were very good on camera. Some people were people that were excellent on camera, but absolutely not journalists. What all of that is to say that it was highly experimental what we were trying to do at certain points, and trying to, so for example, the threshold for monetization on Facebook at the time, which was seen as the quickest way to make some revenue, was 10,000 likes, but then trying to generate engagement sort of from a standing start at that point was an incredible challenge, really, particularly when people had no understanding of what the brand was at that particular time. And if your sole source of revenue at that time is monetizing social media platforms, then those are shifting sands, and there are dangers in terms of whether things are branded as news or not. But there was plenty of our content that wasn't branded as news. But getting from a standing start to ticking those boxes and making sure you are monetized is a significant challenge, and I think one that probably was underestimated.
When it came to that, though, I mean, I feel like we won't spend too much longer on this. Reach had a lot more money than somebody that, you know, potentially Bryony or Jack started off with. There was that investment, but still that pressure to monetize it quickly.
Yeah, but that's normal, isn't it? So it was an ambitious project, and with lots of investment comes the expectation that there's going to be a return on that investment. I think if you look at how somebody creates their own YouTube channel or creates their own TikTok persona or various different things, those things are often done through experimenting and with lots of getting things wrong before they absolutely nail what they're trying to do. And that wasn't something we had the luxury of doing.
Yeah, I imagine there's a lot more pressure within working for such a large corporation. So moving over to, I want to talk a little bit to Bryony and Jack on that. I'll start with you, Bryony. How have you found that as a smaller creator, starting from the ground up, looking at kind of monetization, pressure, metrics, and how you measure your success? So we'll do you, Bryony, and move over to you, Jack.
I think it largely roots in what you are, what your goal is, and what your measure of success is. I think that is one of the most interesting things about the creator economy. Obviously, so I've worked with some of the biggest creators, I've worked with smaller creators, I'm a creator myself, that's kind of gives you the whole breadth of where the creator economy is. And I think often, the bigger organizations, broadcasters, brands are thinking about how they're going to get their investment back. We all know, well, YouTube is a long game, especially if you're starting from scratch with little to no brand, or people don't know who you are. It's even harder if you're doing hard factual. I was really nodding along to what Ben was saying. I worked on Minutes With, which was a lad Bible format, and when we got that IP to a point where we were able to monetize it, it was a very challenging prospect, as you can imagine. So in terms of kind of the monetization piece as a marker for success, I think we're looking at the long game, unless you obviously, like to Luke's point, you have significant investment from the off. But I think there's a bigger point that's interesting about the creator economy in terms of where else are you, what does your brand represent in terms of monetization in other ways? And we're seeing creators now build out brand worlds. So, Diary of a CEO is a really good example of this. They built an IP, but now they're building a world around it. And I think that's a really interesting space that the creator economy is going to. So that sounds like a politician's answer, but I don't think it's always as straightforward as we're launching a channel and now we need to monetize it. If that is your goal, you need to be, strapped in for the long ride. But I think there are other metrics in the creator economy that we can look at in that sense.
Thank you. Jack, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I mean, starting a company, I think, if you're setting out right from the get-go with something like news just to make money, I think you're gonna fail pretty fast. So I think you need to more think about behavior change, and that's like what we've done at Newsreel. That's the thing I've been most focused on, and what I mean by that is can we show that this is making people think about news differently, avoid the news less, engage with high quality news and on a daily basis, those kinds of things. And those are the metrics that I've been looking at. We have done like a small fundraising round. We're doing another one this year. And we're not, pre-revenue. We have revenue coming in from several different sources. But if I set out to make a company like around news and content, I was just concerned about making money, I would just build another TikTok. So I think what we've tried to do is really play the long game. And what we're thinking about is trying to monetize trust rather than just, I think, the easy path, which is just getting engagement. I could definitely build a company like that, not easily, but more easily than what I'm doing now. And I don't think I would be able to live with myself. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Want to head over now to ethical concerns and the way that we potentially can create. Well, I think we're all hoping that with the creator economy, it becomes a sustainable force of news and consumption for media. But let's talk about regulation. Let's talk about how we can make that work in a way that serves our audiences, creates and builds trust, as Jack was just talking about. Ben, let's head to you. So are social media metrics quietly reshaping journalistic ethics? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that a lot of people are concerned by. I wouldn't say that necessarily the ecosystem has changed much from 10 or 15 years ago, when social media metrics kind of shaped how newsrooms actually produced news. I was working for a national newspaper from 2010 to 2018 as head of audience, and we had social media metrics were an input into the stories that we covered every day. And there was an idea that if we publish stories that were on brand, but also might appeal to people on platforms like Facebook and Twitter, then we would gain readers that might become subscribers down the line. There was already in that very kind of late 2010s to early 2010s, social media was driving the kind of behavior of newsrooms, and it was very difficult for editors to distinguish on a day-to-day basis what metrics to follow. You know, if you've worked in a major newsroom, you've seen large screens with dashboards and lots of data, and it's incredibly hard to kind of pass what's important and what's not. So I think actually the creator ecosystem hasn't changed that. There are just more people who are kind of more acutely aware of the data that they're generating from creating content. And you know, as people have alluded to, you know, particularly Luke, they're covering topics that maybe other outlets and publishers have not covered particularly well, whether it's gaming or whether it's health. They're taking a kind of broader, more service level view of what journalism is, as information that helps, you know, people navigate their lives, and that's not actually a bad thing, I don't think. So I would refute the idea that actually it's driving the wrong behaviors. I think newspapers were doing a bit of that themselves 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the bit of a maybe an unpopular opinion, the decline in newspaper and traditional newsroom trust is what has led to such a drive in the creator economy and those individual voices. Thinking about the infrastructure then of creating a sustainable economy and creating that link, Bryony, I know that that's what you do, isn't it? So how do you see that working over the next 5 or 10 years? How can we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think the next 5 to 10 years in terms from an infrastructure perspective is going to be so interesting, because essentially, you know, I was a journalist at the BBC. I benefited from the infrastructure. I was able to make content fast. I was able to protect my mental health. I had a hierarchy that I could go to because that structure existed, and that meant that we were able to produce news at the speed of which we were able to. The creator economy has never had that. They've just had a direct line to their audience, and then they've seen, you know, some of these creators seeing like exponential expansion, but they haven't got the rigor of the TV industry in a broader sense, and also the news industry. So like one concrete example of this is when I moved from BBC to Lab Bible, we were making hard factual content and not news in a we weren't like dropping wires or anything like that, but we were building stories around interesting people. There was no duty of care policy. Now, having come from the BBC, I was like, how is there not a duty of care policy? So I wrote one and I rolled it out, and actually commercially it ended up being such such a selling point. But I think that is just one example of so many that I won't bore you with right now, of where the infrastructure exists in these traditional newsrooms and it doesn't exist yet in the creator economy. And I think we're seeing some of these creator businesses run like media businesses, and that gap is increasingly closing. I think the operational layer underneath it, which in turn will increase the governance and the regulation around creator-led content. And I think news will actually be a massive beneficiary of that. And I think it will be really exciting kind of see how that evolves over the next, I think it will actually be quicker than 5 years, probably next 2 to 3 years would be my forecast.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Luke, as a leader of many newsrooms over your time, and curiously, how did you dance that line, you know, behind being a publisher, not just in Curiously, but when Facebook Lives, you know, the early forms of creation was rolled out, the infrastructure within a team that already existed?
It was challenging, particularly with Facebook Lives. So what we essentially had was newsrooms of reporters with very mixed comfort levels when it came to taking a Facebook Live on, which had become a reasonably important part of what we did, because when Facebook Lives were introduced, they were such a significant driver of reach and engagement. And you had people that were amazing at them, and you had people that were less amazing at them, and you had people that were amazing at them but didn't love to do them, and then you had people that loved to do them but weren't so amazing at them, and all these different things. So I remember one of the first things that we did when I worked in Birmingham was we did some Facebook Live training, but I was delivering that Facebook Live training and I was not a broadcast journalist, and I had no clue what made something successful on camera. It was more about prep and making sure that they were comfortable, and making sure that they had things that they could do if nothing was happening during the Facebook Live and things like that. So it was a big shift, essentially, asking people who were quite traditional in their approach sometimes, but willing to learn different things, to suddenly be on a Facebook live stream where you can see in real time some of the feedback that is coming in, which is not always the most positive in the world. Now, there were ways around that. You know, we always tried to make sure that there were two people doing a Facebook Live, particularly so that person couldn't necessarily see the comments. If they were out and about, we'd make sure there was someone in the office moderating those comments to protect them from, you know, unavoidably nasty stuff that can be out there. So yeah, there were ways around it, but we were learning as we were going. And
yeah, I think that also requires a lot of manpower, which is something that we've talked about over the past few days. Is that do you have the infrastructure and the teams to do that moderation, to send to out? You know, when I was a local journalist, it was me, myself, and I, and definitely on the other end of some of those comments. Super quickly then, because we're about to move on to questions, I do want to open the floor to you and to Jack and you, Ben. I just want to, if you could briefly tell me how you manage that mental health and protection, being more of a creator-led with your app, Jack. How do you manage that in your newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I really stress that to my reporters. We do have our own in-house staff, and then we are bringing on contributors as well who are creators themselves. To the own internal newsroom, I always try to check in on them and to make sure that they are, when they're covering sensitive stories, that they're doing okay, and that I think those kinds of like simple check-ins can be like really powerful. I haven't had those at some of the news outlets I've worked for, but treating reporters as like human beings instead of just like content mills, I think is like such a basic principle that's like unfortunately not practiced a lot in the news industry. It's kind of like just sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just like go out there and report and don't stop until you have the next story. So I think that's the next thing. And then two, I think like I try to really stress like all the time like what the goal is. Like the goal with newsreel is not traffic. Like we're trying to reject the traffic model. So on that and in that regard, I think again I go back to it like the incentives are different, and therefore like I think that model of like writing for different kind of incentives, like can we help people become better informed citizens, have more productive conversations, live healthier lives, then you're helping the reporter as well. Like it doesn't just help the reader, you're also helping the reporter as they're writing the story. So those are the some of the ways that I sort of think about those issues. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, as your leader, you're not only considering the editorial flow, but the HR aspect of that. And really quickly, Ben, on a much grander scale at FT Strategies, what would your very quick recommendations to any news organizations watching this panel, which I'm sure is absolutely loads, for the bigger picture?
Yeah, I suppose like there's a couple of things. I mean, I think the various people have touched on the importance of kind of having a direct relationship with the audience, and I think it's really interesting to see many creators who have become big on platforms through creating content and kind of working with the algorithm are now starting to do that in very concerted ways. You know, I'm thinking about creators who've started newsletters to establish a direct connection. You know, they have an email address with that reader, or have a store or other products that they're selling. So they're using that kind of shop front of being on a platform to create a more kind of valuable direct relationship. And I think that direct relationship also has implications for working patterns, as people have talked about. You know, if you know your audience, in many cases it's easier to serve them. You can be much more kind of targeted. You're less likely to get the kind of blowback and boost that people have talked about on this panel. So there are lots of kind of benefits to creating that direct relationship beyond the sustainability financial aspect. It's sustainable in terms of the creator's kind of mental health and personal well-being as well, as I'd argue. And yeah, it will differ for different types of creators. You know, our analysis that we did came up with a kind of typology for creators where we had investigators and commentators and also explainers, and people who are investigating will have a very different set of needs than somebody who is explaining or commentating on news. So again, we need to be very nuanced and careful with how we refer to news creators. I think there are increasingly a segmentation of news creators that we should be aware of.
Thank you. That's great. Well, that brings us to the end of our kind of discussion. So I want to open the floor now to questions. We've had a few come up here, which I'll run down. But if anybody watching has anything that crops up for Luke, Ben, Jack, and Bryony, then please do jump in. I'll jump down to Jennifer's question. Bryony, with regards to regulation and ethics, as a journalist at the BBC, especially at the BBC, you were used to upholding very strict standards. But how does that fit in with what you do now and the broader news creator economy?
Yes, great question. So yes, as you can imagine, the standards that were upheld as a reporter and a journalist producer were extremely high. What I have done is in the work that I do now, and I work for creators, I work for TV production companies, and I work for broadcasters. I basically imported that rigor, and now I implement it into the structures that I'm suggesting that they build. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about job roles and roles and responsibilities, tools that they're using, the way that they're empowering their team, everything that you would just expect if you walked in as a producer or reporter into a newsroom that already exists. You don't even kind of think about the fact that build is there. Those are the builds that are now happening in the creator economy. So I basically have taken so much of the rigor, but I think the key difference is that I import the things that can be implemented at speed, because news works at speed because it has the infrastructure. The creator economy works at speed even without the infrastructure. And it evolves, in literally real time, which news does as well, but it's just a slightly different beast because you're responding to the data that you've got right in front of you. So in very practical terms, the duty of care policy was one of them, but also in the tools, the language that's used, empowering people. And in terms of the news, I think I've worked in hard factual in YouTube and social, which is slightly different to news. And I think I would lean to Ben or Jack to answer that point probably better than I could.
No worries. Thank you very much. Jack, if you mentioned earlier, if you wanted to make money, you would use TikTok. Do you think that TikTok, and I'm going to roll that out to most social media platforms actually, can be used as a credible news source? And do you think that social media restriction, like is happening in, Australia, parts of America, would make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, there are, amazing journalists, amazing subject matter experts on social media. Like, as journalists, we have to acknowledge that. And I think we most do, even though we don't sometimes want to admit it. We're not the gatekeepers anymore. Social media is, and soon AI will be. That's the next big sea change. But at the same time, like, it's great that people have a chance to say what they want to say, and it's also a bad thing that everybody can say what they want to say. And so that means that, like, we need other tools to sort of mitigate against the overwhelm, the anxiety, the chaos that comes with that kind of world. And again, I go back to it, but the things that big tech are optimizing for. So, I used to work as not a fact checker, but like an open source intelligence an investigative reporter. I broke stories about like AI, the source of the Haitian migrants eating cats and dogs story, and during the 2024 election. And I've come away sort of being very like sort of souring on fact checking and debunking. I just don't think it scales fast enough in the AI age. And I mentioned this in the chat, but the thing that I'm like a huge proponent of is the notion of like pre-bunking. And very simply, that just means a shot in the arm. And so that, in other words, like it means giving people information about the sources that they're getting their news from before they encounter those sources. And it seems so basic, but we just don't have that on the internet right now. And so I think boosting resources that are doing that is very, very important. Advocating for basic changes to social media is very, very important. I mean, look even what like X has done, right, recently, which is now giving like the country of origin of some of these accounts. They did that earlier this year, and then suddenly these accounts that were like Trump lover 8282 was actually based in like Macedonia, not in the United States, and their engagement plummeted overnight. Like that's the most basic thing that like every platform could have done from the get-go, and they just didn't because it breaks their financial model. So I think we should be advocating for those kinds of things.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate your answer for that one. And then I've got one more question, which I'm going to throw out to Luke, because I think you have direct experience dealing with it, but I am going to combine them. And that is, how do we get the next generation of creators? How do we attract people? And can you just take anybody? Can you take a journalist and make them a creator? And how do we attract the youth into that?
how do we get the next generation of creators? Do you mean we as an industry? Is that what you're asking me?
The royal we. I mean, not the royal we, but anybody interested in the news. You know, it's the age-old question.
So I think it's less about encouraging people to be creators because they're going to do it anyway. Nobody needs me as an editor to encourage people to create a TikTok and get started. They're going to do that anyway. To the question of whether to how we can encourage them to, you know, create content responsibly, how to tackle difficult issues in a responsible way, that is something I do not have the answer to, and it is something that needs really creative answers, I think.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That'll be the next topic for our next panel. You can join into that. Thank you very much, everybody. Ben, Bryony, Jack, and Luke.